Friends, Uncle Sam is offering you the chance to combine a patriotic duty with a wonderful vacation. Why not spend this year's vacation on a farm? You'll have a lot of fun, and what's more important, you'll help harvest food for yourself and your fighting men for the coming year. Get full details at your U.S. Employment Office, WEAF, New York.
The National Broadcasting Company interrupts this program to bring you a special broadcast.
President Truman has just announced that the Anglo-American and Russian armies have met in the heart of Nazi Germany. The juncture took place yesterday at 2 p.m. Eastern Wartime at Torgau on the Elbe, 75 miles south of Berlin. Patrols had established contact the day before. The American 69th Division had the honor of enacting the historic meeting for our forces. President Truman issued a short 300-word statement. He said, in the main, the Anglo-American armies under the command of General Eisenhower have met the Soviet forces where they intended to meet, in the heart of Nazi Germany. The enemy has been cut in two. This is not the hour of final victory in Europe, says Mr. Truman, but the hour draws near. He continues, the union of our arms has a meaning for the world which the world will not miss. It means first that the last faint, desperate hope of Hitler and his gangster government has been extinguished. The common front and the common cause of the powers allied in this war against tyranny and inhumanity have been demonstrated in fact as they have long been demonstrated in determination. Second, the President says, the junction of our forces at this moment signalizes to ourselves and to the world that the collaboration of our nations in the cause of peace and freedom is an effective collaboration which can surmount the greatest difficulties of the most extensive campaign in the history and succeed. Finally, says the President, this great triumph of Allied arms and Allied strategy is such a tribute to the courage and determination of Franklin Roosevelt as no words could ever speak, and that could be accomplished only by the persistence and the courage of the fighting soldiers and sailors of the Allied nations. But until our enemies are finally subdued in Europe, he continues, and in the Pacific, there must be no relaxation of effort on the home front. We return you now from Washington to the newsroom, NBC newsroom in New York.
You have heard the momentous news of the juncture of American and Russian armies, which cuts the remainder of the German Reich in two. Soon we expect to have for you first-hand accounts from London, from Paris, from the First Army headquarters, and from the American Ninth Army. First, we hear from John McBain, NBC reporter with the American First Army. For his story, we take you to NBC in Western Europe.
This McBain, ready to go ahead. Ready to go ahead for NBC.
Apparently, we're having some trouble getting John McBain, NBC reporter with the American First Army, but come in, John McBain. We'll try him once again. John McBain, come in.
I'll go ahead in 5 seconds, NBC. This is John McBain with the First Army in Germany. I saw American soldiers join hands with the men of the Red Army. It was more than joining hands. We hugged and pounded each other. Some of the Red Army men kissed us. Men who'd fought the Germans to a standstill told us that the day of our meeting was one of the great days of history, the greatest day of their lives. The first contact didn't take place in the way that it had been planned. The Russians were on the Elbe. We of the First Army were on the Mulde, 30 miles from the Elbe. Russian patrols came down in plain sight of us, almost to the Mulde. The American 69th Division sent out patrols that went right to the Elbe and made the first contact. Then correspondents of the First Army, 30 or 40 of us, piled into jeeps, left our lines and headed for the Russians. We went on roads that were streaming with people, German civilians, soldiers, slave laborers, Allied war prisoners. We came on a deserted-looking town, wheeled into the square, and slowly got out of our cars. Suddenly, at doorways on 2 sides of the square, stood soldiers of the Red Army. They dropped their rifles. Someone said, "The Russians."
Hello, Blue. Okay.
Army men were surrounded by a dozen men in American uniforms, slapping him on the back.
For an order of the day from General Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, whose First Army men made the first contact.
The order reads, soldiers of the 1st, 3rd, 9th, and 15th American Army. 1640 hours on April 25th, 1945, in the 29th Montevideo War against the German government, American troops of the 12th Army Group joined forces with Soviet elements of Marshal Konev's 1st Ukrainian Army Group. These armies have come to you from the ruins of Stalingrad and Sevastopol, across the scorched cities of the Ukraine. In 2 years, they have smashed 1,400 miles through the German army to drive the enemy from Russia and pursue him to the Elbe. Their achievements, and they have given immortality to a people that would not be conquered, are made more meaningful by your own deeds. Across 3,800 miles of an ocean supply line, you forced to coast the enemy have been years preparing against you. Within 4 months after landing, you destroyed whole armies to take Paris, France, and give the world the symbol of freedom. When the enemy raised a new army and threw it into the winter battle of the Ardennes, you smashed it and flung its remnants back. You have beaten and broken down his mighty secret line. You crossed the Rhine in your stride, encircled and reduced the Ruhr. By demonstrating new lessons in mobile warfare, you annihilated whole groups of German armies in the West on their own German soil. In 10 months, you have fought your way 700 miles from the beaches. These accomplishments were secured by your courage, your resourcefulness, and by your comrades who died to achieve them. You have shared in the liberation of 4 nations, given hope to others, and conquered half of Germany. The people of America who armed you have had great faith in you. You have justified that faith as you will in the battles that follow. The order is signed, Owen Bradley, General of the United States Army. I return you now to NBC in New York.
You have just heard from John McBain on the Western Front, and you have also heard from our David Anderson there, telling this glorious news of the juncture of American and Russian armies today. And now we have a man standing by in Paris. Roy Porter, our man in Paris, will report to us now. Come in, Roy. Roy Porter is standing by in Paris to tell us what has happened in this juncture of the Russian and the American armies. We'll try Paris once more. Roy Porter, in Paris, come in. That news has just been flashed to us from Europe, from John McVeigh, from David Anderson, and other reporters are standing by to give their reactions to this official news that Germany now has been cut in two. This juncture of the Russian armies and the American armies now isolates northern Germany and the port cities left to the Reich from the Hitler forces in the southern mountains. Each of these two German forces now is fighting not only a two-front war, but a war from all sides. From the crossing of the Rhine River to their present position, American troops have taken giant strides. American tanks racing across Germany have made up to 40 miles a day. They've managed to plunge forward much faster than anyone dared to hope. After the German defenses just beyond the Rhine River were breached, there seemed to be nothing to stop that powerful American advance. Germany had concentrated many of its divisions in the east against the Russians, of course. Because of destruction by great forces of Allied bombers, the Nazis no longer could move men and tanks with facility back and forth across Germany fast enough to meet any threat. Both General Patton and General Hodges put the task of cutting across Germany up to their tank force commanders. And today we've made an official contact with the Russians, clasped hands with them, as President Truman has said. Germany is now divided into two parts. That American First Army, the first to smash across the Rhine, the first to meet the Russians, is led by a three-star general known throughout the army as the soldier's soldier. And I understand that Roy Porter is standing by in Paris now. Come in, Roy. Tell us about it from there.
Porter's in Paris. I saw the Americans and the Russians in contact across the Elbe River yesterday afternoon from a Mustang fighter of the 67th Tactical Reconnaissance Group of the 9th Air Force. Captain Frank Robison of San Diego and I had flown along the river from the vicinity of Dessau to near Torgau. We watched the Russians moving slowly but certainly forward along the back roads in formerly German territory. And when we got to a point near Torgau, we saw Russian vehicles on both banks of the Elbe, which was a clear indication that a crossing of the river had already been made. It was on a little spit of land extending out into the river, where apparently there had been some sort of a bridge previously, but there was not any kind of a crossing for vehicles when we were there. The glint of a cable caught our eyes as brilliant sunshine flashed it up to us. There was a sort of a raft, at least that's what it looked like to us, near our side of the shore. And parked on the American side were several vehicles which were not marked with the American white star, which undoubtedly could not have been German, and which bore all the earmarks of Russian vehicles, perhaps of American manufacture. Captain Robinson and I discussed thoroughly the possibility that a crossing had already been made, and reported after our return to base that we believed that the Russians were already across the river. The official announcement of the link-up specifies that it happened at Torgau, first between American and Russian patrols, and later at a meeting of General Staff officers of the two Allied armies. We saw the columns of the American First Army moving up the road from Torgau, although at the time we were not able to identify them as any particular unit. They were moving in a long, steady stream down the road toward this one spot on the riverbank I have already described. It's a little difficult to get across the idea of the tremendous number of vehicles which were in motion on both sides of the river, all moving in what appeared to be a predetermined direction. The Russians from the north and the east, depending on where the river bends were located, and the Americans coming in just as steadily from the south and the west. We noted one rather peculiar thing, that there were no tanks in these columns, but on the Russian side there seemed to be a good many guns moving up with the other vehicles and sandwiched in between them. The Americans moved up in close order, and they were easy to spot from the air, with their white stars on the hoods of their vehicles. There was a steady stream going down to the river, and a few other cars, which looked mostly like jeeps, dodging in and out of the column, and occasionally turning around to speed back the other way. The on-moving Americans kept close to the right-hand side of the road. The Russians, on their side, were spread out along the back roads, moving mostly down the center and in a long, straight line. Some of their cars were marked with red stars. Some of them had blobs of white paint on them, which were much more visible from the air. There seemed to be several boats inside the Russian column, although we could not tell positively as the long line passed through wooded areas next to the riverbank. It was a thrilling sight, because high over the river itself, we could look one way and see our allies moving up, and on the other side, the Americans were just visible in the sunlight. And our seat, thousands of feet in the air, was a real grandstand seat for this historic event. Off in the distance to the north, the city of Kosvig was smoldering with long columns of smoke rising high into the air. Russian motorized patrols were scurrying over the countryside down below. And in a field, with perhaps half a dozen bomb craters close together, there lay a number of bodies sprawled on the brilliant green of a spring pasture. That was the way we saw it at just about the time the Americans and the Russians were making contact. We watched it unfold clearly below us, not too high in the air to get a good view, just as it was happening. This is Roy Porter in Paris, returning you to the NBC newsroom in New York.
And that's the way the NBC reporters in Washington, in Paris, with the American First and the American Ninth Armies have told us this story today, this great story that we've been waiting for so long, the juncture of the American and Russian armies finally now at the little town of Torgau, in the Prussian province of Saxony, situated on the left bank of the Elbe, 30 miles east and northeast of Leipzig and 26 miles southeast of Wittenberg. It has now been confirmed what we have known for some time, or what we have guessed at for some time, and it was Major General E.F. Reinhardt himself who led the 69th American Infantry Division for the first juncture between the Russians from the east and the other allies from the west, our American allies and the British and so on from the west. It was just 2 days ago that the NBC newsroom here in New York received a dispatch fairly glowing with the optimism felt by the troops of the 69th Division. NBC has brought you Roy Porter from Paris, John McMain with the American First Army, David Anderson with the American Ninth Army, telling you this great story, and also Morgan Beatty in Washington, bringing this great story of the juncture of the Russian and American armies in Germany today. Germany is now cut in two. This is not VE Day.
This is the National Broadcasting Company.
This is Morgan Beatty speaking. I'll be back in a moment with news of the day.
Mr. and Mrs. New Yorker, are you interested in the youth of your city? As you walk along the streets, do you see groups of boys and girls with nothing to do, hanging around corners or playing in the streets, in danger of being hit by passing cars? Well, if you want to do something really constructive for these boys and girls in your neighborhood, if you want to do your part in helping to solve some of the problems of youth in your city, join the organization which has been working untiringly to accomplish all this. Join the Police Athletic League as an associate member and help provide proper, healthful recreational facilities for the children of New York. Be a big pal to a little pal by supporting the PAL in its important work. For information, write or telephone the Police Athletic League, 240 Center Street, New York, 13, New York. I'll repeat that. Write or telephone the Police Athletic League, 240 Center Street, New York, 13, New York, or contact your nearest police station. And now from Washington, here is Morgan Beatty.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Morgan Beatty. I step aside today, and in the place of our usual news and commentary, we bring you a special program. 6 United States senators, all of whom have been intimately associated with the appropriation of our monies and the vast realignment of our lives for war, have graciously consented to come here to the Senate Radio Gallery today to give you their impression of the symbolic meaning behind the linking of the Anglo-American and Russian armies in central Germany, south of Berlin. First, the acting majority leader of the Senate, Senator Lister Hill of Alabama. Senator, would you give us the benefit of your experience? Help us appreciate the importance of this event, sir?
You and I and every American can rejoice over the glad news that has been flashed to us. The juncture means that the defeat of the Nazi is conclusively sealed. It does not mean, however, that there may not yet be hard fighting in Germany, as strong points of resistance have to be wiped out. The juncture of our forces who have fought and advanced all the way from the now distant Normandy beaches with the Russians who have fought and advanced over 1,000 miles is the splendid fruition of that unity between us and our allies, for which our late departed Commander-in-Chief, President Roosevelt, so tirelessly labored, and to which he contributed so much. The juncture has been accomplished because of the heroism and the everlasting courage of the Russian soldier, and because our heroic and valiant sons, in their grim determination, have marched on and fought on, whatever the sacrifice, to take the next hill, to knock out a German pillbox, to dig the treacherous Nazi out of his hole, to smash an enemy fort, to defeat the enemy. Today, as you and I rejoice, we know that there will still be fighting in Germany, and that a long, tough, and arduous task yet lies ahead of us in the defeat of Japan. We rejoice, but we rejoice in prayers of thanksgiving and in resolutions of a new dedication, a dedication that each of us will continue to back our fighting men and women to the limit, that we will continue on our jobs, that there'll be no laying off, no let up, for an hour lost here at home may mean a life lost in Germany or in the Pacific, a dedication that the juncture between us and the Russians will be an enduring juncture, and that working together, the United States and Russia, with the other peace-loving nations, will make certain the building of lasting peace.
Thank you, Senator Hill. Senator Wallace White, the Republican leader, is with us, too. Senator, what does the great event of April the 27th mean to Maine and America?
Well, the stirring news of the joining of our military forces with those of our Russian ally gives new and strengthened hope that the long and sacrificial road along which our youth and manhood have so long struggled nears its end, and that glorious triumph in the European field of war is at hand. The hearts of all our people raise voices of thanksgiving. At the Golden Gate, we strive in confident faith that the universal yearning of mankind for ordered law, for justice and the blessings of peace is to find expression and assurance in the work of those there gathered. This, then, is a day of promise to nations and mankind everywhere. Let us give our thanks to the God of battles and offer up our supplications to the God of peace.
Thank you, Senator White. And now, Senator Robert La Follette of the great state of Wisconsin. Would you give us your impressions, sir?
With every American citizen, I rejoice at the thrilling news of the juncture of our armies and those of Soviet Russia. I trust that this juncture will not be taken by the American people as an indication that the war is over. There is probably tough fighting ahead in Europe. We know there is a tough battle before us in the Pacific. Without detracting for one moment from the achievement and the heroism of the troops, let us also this day remember that it was the wonderful production of the American farmer, the businessman, and American labor which has made this juncture in Europe possible. Let us all close ranks and work all the harder to achieve a quick victory in the Pacific. I trust that this juncture indicates also that we may unite in securing a just and lasting peace.
Thank you, Senator La Follette. And now, Senator Warren Austin of Vermont, another staunch fighter for world collaboration.
All peace-loving nations rejoice that the Anglo-British forces have joined the Russian armies, thereby splitting the forces of the enemy in two. Our gratitude to the brave men and women of these triumphant armies and to the skillful leadership of their officers is solemnly recorded. The spirit which animated our leaders and their men, the skill with which they fought, the divine guidance which they followed, made possible this great step toward ultimate victory. As further evidence of our understanding of what they have suffered and achieved, we shall continue our determined effort on the home front to provide, through Lend-Lease and by direct supply to our own forces, the increasing support necessary for the complete defeat and crushing of the enemy in Europe. At the same time, we courageously face the obligations of the second half of this tremendous war, with the hope of speeding up operations against Japan, with a view to victory with a minimum of loss of precious lives. This would be harder to do if we indulge the natural impulse to relax because the job in Europe is nearly finished. We thank God that our losses have not been greater than they have, but we are filled with sorrow because of the thousands of casualties already suffered, the families bereaved, and those that must adjust themselves to changes caused by battle injuries and rehabilitation of their maimed and sick ones. The fatigue of men who have been fighting for years must be relieved by replacements or by refreshment and reinvigoration here at home in order that they may meet the Japanese enemy, 5 millions of which have not yet been engaged by us in major battle. After VE Day, we will enter upon the most difficult task of reversing the pipeline and returning our personnel, equipment, and unused supplies, while at the same time starting westward across the Pacific a new pipeline, which will be twice as long as that across the Atlantic. This pipeline must not merely be started, but it must be kept full and flowing constantly all of the time until we have conquered the Japs. While our hearts are bursting with the emotions excited by the great progress indicated, we rededicate ourselves to invincible effort in the second half of the war.
Thank you, Senator Austin. And now, a man who early recognized the new responsibilities of the United States in a new world, Senator Carl Hatch of New Mexico.
I am happy to be here today and to say this word about this magnificent juncture which has been made today. And I am reminded just now of what Kipling said in his eloquent phrases, "East is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet." They have met today. They have met in a concerted effort to drive military power from the face of the earth and to destroy the superior race of men that thought it could rule the world. My reaction goes back to San Francisco right now in the hopes that the so-called great powers, the United States of the Soviet Union, Great Britain, China, France, and our own United States of America, may agree and work out a program that will forever drive from the world of men the curse of war. That is my hope. That is my reaction. And that is my prayer.
Thank you, Senator Hatch. And now, Senator Scott Lucas of the great state of Illinois.
The American people rejoice with all the other Allied peoples in the juncture of the Anglo-American and Russian armies in Germany. The Allied nations have long been joined together in spirit to carry out one common purpose, defeat of tyranny, to accomplish one objective, liberation of mankind. History will record the significance of the meeting of the Anglo-American and the Russian armies at the very moment the diplomatic representatives of these and other liberty-loving governments are meeting for the purpose of preventing for all time the necessity of their armies marching again. This historic meeting of our great armies should give to the delegates at the San Francisco Conference added hope and encouragement for ultimate success. As we are gladdened with the uniting of our armies in Europe, we must not overlook what must be very plain to those of our respective armed forces who have doggedly fought their way through to the heart of the monster which Nazism has made of practically all Germany. We must remember, too, that we still have much to do in the Pacific to crush another savage foe. While we rejoice at the beginning of the end in Europe of the greatest organized military effort the world has ever seen, we renew our determination to accomplish with greater speed and progress its companion drive in the Pacific. There, too, it is our clear duty to annihilate the curse of tyranny by crushing the evil dogma which motivates it and the tools by which it is enforced. In the midst of our gratitude and exultation over this climax of America's greatest and yet most tragic undertaking, our thoughts turn inevitably to that wise and stalwart leader, the late Franklin D. Roosevelt, who more than any other individual made this day possible. Out of our grief because he was not spared to see the success of his efforts comes the unflinching determination that we will carry on his work in the same spirit in which he undertook it and gave his all to complete it.
Thank you, Senator Scott Lucas. Senator Alvin Barkley, the majority leader of the Senate, once said off the record that the senators of the United States were no better and no worse than the rest of us, that they represented all of us. It is true that they do represent all of us, but I submit, ladies and gentlemen, that today they are much better than the rest of us in expressing the feelings that we all have today, that we must continue to work to complete this war on both sides of the world, that we must rejoice, yes, but just a few moments, just for a short time, that we must seek, in the end, justice for all peoples of the world. That's all for now, and thank you. I'll be back at this same time tomorrow.
Here's an important announcement. Brigadier General Louis B. Ballantyne, Commander General of the New Jersey State Guard, has made an appeal to the citizens of New Jersey for additional recruits for the New Jersey State Guard to replace members of the State Guard who have either enlisted or been inducted into the Federal Armed Services. The State Guard is completely equipped with uniforms, arms, and equipment, all supplied by the War Department, and the training of the Guard is in accord with the training directives outlined by the Secretary of War. Training is conducted one night each week in the Armory, and non-commissioned officer schools are also conducted weekly for the instruction and training of non-commissioned officers. If you are between the ages of 17 and 55, apply at one of the 33 local armories in New Jersey. You'll find one near your home, and the company troop commander will give you complete information. Visit your local New Jersey armory today if you're between the ages of 17 and 55. And keep up with the news with Morgan Beatty. Morgan Beatty is heard Monday through Friday at this same time. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
Today's top story, of course, is the news of a junction between American and Russian armies south of Berlin. Dramatic announcement of the union was made simultaneously today in London, Washington, and Moscow. Later in this broadcast, NBC will bring you special reports from Paris and London on that juncture. Another big junction is shaping up in Austria tonight, where radio contact already has been established between General Patton's 3rd American Army and the 2nd and 3rd Armies of the Ukraine west of Vienna. Those tanks of General Patton plunged unopposed into Austria today, 85 miles from the last reported position of the Russians in the Danube Valley. This junction, like the one affected south of Berlin, will have great strategic value to the Allies. It will cut off the great munitions and arms centers of Czechoslovakia from the Bavarian fortress in southern Germany, depriving those last-stand Nazis of needed supplies. The surprise dash of General Patton's armies caught the Germans off guard on the Austrian border today. The 11th Armored Division of that force had been moving toward Passau border, 70 miles from Berchtesgaden. Pilots warned the 11th that Germans were massing to meet them there. The division roared eastward and into Austria, 21 miles from Passau. They're now 33 miles from the big Austrian city of Linz. Radio contact was established when Americans heard a Russian from Marshal Tolbuchin's 2nd Ukrainian Army over their field radios. He was calling, "This is the Red Army, calling the American Army." A Russian colonel who had been liberated by American troops picked up their transmitter and replied, "Acknowledging your message, the Americans are now in radio contact with you." With the radio junction established, American artillery spearheads halted their fire whenever targets could not be observed. Back to the west of those armored spearheads, other Third Army troops completed the destruction of the enemy's Danube River line with the capture of Regensburg and Ingolstadt, two strongholds about 35 miles apart. These forces were 38 miles north of Munich. Even closer to Munich were two armored divisions of the American 7th Army, which are racing toward the city from the west. These divisions have scored an 18-mile breakthrough and are 35 miles away. Augsburg is almost within the grasp of the 7th, which is now negotiating for its surrender. Other 7th Army troops have seized a town 28 miles from the Austrian border. In close cooperation with the Americans, French 1st Army troops captured the city of Constance on the lake of the same name. Many high-ranking Nazis are believed to be in Constance, seeking to escape from Germany into Switzerland. Adjacent to the 1st Army front, where troops are celebrating the junction with the Russians, 9th Army troops are probing the German corridor in order to effect their own junction. German reports say the 9th has made new crossings over the Elbe and is awaiting a union with Russians some 13 miles away. And now for more news of that junction between the 69th Division of the American 1st Army and Marshal Konyev's 1st Ukrainian Army, we take you to NBC in Paris.
The junction of American and Russian troops on the banks of the Elbe was expected by the public in Paris. But although it comes as a sort of an anticlimax because some papers announced it 10 days ago, the French radio thrilled their listening public tonight with the official announcement that this junction was done. The news comes as great news, as a relief, too. For several days, the American and Russian armies seemed to grope for each other in the dark. At least they seemed to be doing this to the expectant public. And French correspondents at the front insisted on the extraordinary last moments of the American-Russian junction. They described the fluidity of the front, the American army waiting motionless on the banks of the Elbe, and the Russian army advancing cautiously. One correspondent compares the meeting of the two armies to the delicate and perilous and much smaller scale job of bringing two great ships side by side together in mid-ocean. "We have been waiting for 5 days at this extreme point of the front," writes another French reporter. "We have not heard a single cannon nor a single rifle shot. We know where the Russians are, but can't seem to lay our hands on them. As for the Germans, they have disappeared." Well, obviously, this reporter sent in his article before the junction occurred. The Germans have disappeared, all right, but the Russians are there. This afternoon in Paris, at the French Club of the Rue d'Ornu, the press division of the French War Office showed a number of moving picture films to a choice gathering of officers. There were Americans and British officers, French officers and Canadians and Australians, Scots and Poles, and in uniforms that Parisians are learning to know, there were many officers of the Russian army. The films shown were pictures of the front, of that sector of the front which the French are covering. Then at 6 o'clock, the showing was interrupted. Lights were turned on in the room. The Allied officers blinked at the speaker who stood up before the screen. And then came the announcement. General Bradley's order of the day read in French. General Bradley's order of the day announcing the long-awaited junction of two powerfully victorious armies. And when the speaker was through, all these officers of all the Allied armies let out a lusty cheer and applauded for a long moment. This historical moment. This is Archie Nye returning you to NBC Newsroom in New York.
You've just heard a special broadcast from NBC in Paris. For London's reaction to the historic link-up between Russian and American armies, we take you now to NBC in London.
This is Chester Morrison in London. People in London are not doing any celebrating about the joining of the armies in Germany. They're celebrating the return of some of their friends and relatives who have come out of German prison camps and the return of some of their soldiers home on leave. They are not even thinking that it was not more than 3 weeks ago when the last V-2 bomb fell. These Englishmen are funny people. They have been at war at home for so long that events in Europe don't mean so much to them as they mean to the people in our country. When Englishmen get home on leave, the first thing they do is take off their soldier suits and put on ordinary civilian clothes. London is full of men who would have been asked a year ago why they were not in khaki. Now khaki is unfashionable. Now people are less interested in the joining of the armies, as you might expect. London didn't even celebrate on Monday when the blackout was officially lifted. As a matter of fact, thousands of people in London, mostly old folks who don't change their habits quickly, still spend their nights in the subway stations because they have been doing it so long that they have come to prefer that to going home. And England seems to be thinking more about getting back to the old ways than about such signposts of history as the meeting of two victorious armies. England thinks about new houses to replace the ones that have been blown up. England thinks about going to the beach. The people who own the hotels at the beaches think about boosting their prices. And the people who have to pay the prices think about how high the prices are. This is really a healthful country to be in. It's tired, but it has got lots of muscle. At this late date, it doesn't throw its hat in the air about nothing. England knows the war is not over just because the armies have met in Germany. This is Chester Morrison in London, returning you to NBC, New York.
Great chunks of flaming Berlin were bitten off by the Russians today as they captured the large suburbs of Potsdam and Spandau while continuing to overwhelm the Germans inside their own capital. At least 3/4 of Berlin is in Russian hands. Nearly all of the city is a wilderness of crumbled stone. Red Army forces are throwing another ring of encirclement around the Nazi garrison inside Berlin. The German defenders have already suffered tens of thousands of casualties, says Radio Moscow, and are incapable of caring for their own wounded. German propagandists continue to put their story that Hitler is directing the defenses of Berlin from within the city. A Swedish dispatch says he has headquarters in the Tiergarten, the famous park in the center of Berlin. Russian announcements, however, say they do not expect to find the Fuhrer in the city. He was there when he prepared his war of conquest, Moscow said, but in his hour of defeat, one can be sure that Hitler is as far from Berlin as possible. Radio Hamburg attempted to bolster the Nazis with promises that a relief column would break into the capital, which has been encircled with Russian steel and fire. A report from Radio Atlantique, heard in New York by NBC, says the Russians have captured the Tempelhof airdrome inside the city. That report has just been confirmed by Moscow. American Fifth Army troops in Italy swept into Genoa today as Nazi forces continued their disorganized retreat toward the Alps. Genoa, the home of Christopher Columbus, was captured in a swift American advance up the Ligurian coast. The Fifth Army troops found Genoa partially cleared of Nazis by the Italian partisan forces who rose up against the Nazis several days ago. Other American units have pushed within 35 miles of Milan tonight, and on the British Eighth Army front, the enemy has been unable to reorganize his scattered forces. Inside Milan, radio broadcasts indicate that partisan forces have taken over most of the city. In any case, they've seized the radio station and declare that the Committee for National Liberation in northern Italy is assuming the powers of government. The radio repeated military orders from General Mark Clark, directing the partisans to maintain order and avoid indiscriminate acts of violence. General Clark was quoted as saying that several days may elapse before Allied troops can reach liberated areas. Reports from Genoa said earlier that all enemy fleet units had been seized in the harbor, that 1,500 German prisoners were also being held. An unidentified speaker from Milan repeated the story that Mussolini has been arrested near the Swiss frontier. The broadcast said the one-time Duce was yellow with fury and fear. An unconfirmed report from the Swiss radio says Mussolini's wife and daughter made another attempt last night to cross the frontier but were refused admission. Partisan forces are now believed to be in control of 3 North Italy provinces, the provinces of Lombardy, Piedmont, and Liguria. Allied troops fanning out into northern Italy are having more difficulty with fuel and supply problems than from enemy resistance. Entire German units have been captured as they retreated toward the Brenner Pass, only to find their escape routes cut off by the Allied forces. One flustered Nazi pilot brought his plane down at Verona airfield and was met by a cluster of well-armed Americans. Verona itself is described as a shattered city. The town where Romeo and Juliet once loved and died has been a target for Allied bombings, and remaining structures were destroyed by the retreating Nazis. That German general who gave up to American forces yesterday is revealed today as Lieutenant General Kurt Dittmar, one of the Reich's best-known military analysts. He surrendered to 9th Army troops at Magdeburg after crossing the river in a rowboat. Reports from inside Germany about a fortnight ago claimed that Dittmar had committed suicide. As a military commentator for the Nazis, he was frequently inaccurate, but he had no disposition to stop his predictions after falling into American hands. The war will be over in a few days, and Hitler will die in Berlin, Dittmar said. He added that Hermann Goering probably had been executed already. Germany lost the war the day the Hitler assassination plot failed, he said. Out in San Francisco, most of the preliminary fog was cleared away today as the United Nations settled their early differences and got down to work. Secretary of State Stettinius will be the permanent chairman of the all-important steering committee, which will shape the program and policies of the conference. Russia earlier had objected to Stettinius' holding the post on a permanent basis. The permanent chairman of the conference will rotate among the Big Four sponsoring nations in alphabetical order, which means, of course, that the Chinese will hold the chair first. China's delegation played a big role in settling the preliminary differences, and Russia's Molotov made the Soviet concessions in a dramatic speech. A bulletin from San Francisco says the conference steering committee has agreed to give the republics of White Russia and Ukraine seats at the conference, along with the seat already provided for the USSR. The move to give Russia 3 votes had already received the backing of the American delegation. That same steering committee declined to act today on Russia's request that Poland be represented at the conference. It also set up a 14-member executive committee, which includes the Big Five: America, Russia, Britain, France, and China. In addition, representatives from Australia, Canada, the Netherlands, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Brazil, Mexico, Chile, and Iran will sit on the executive committee. Congress gave final approval today to an extension of the Selective Service Act and sent the measure to President Truman for a signature. The principal new feature in the bill is an amendment which prohibits the use of 18-year-old draftees until they've had 6 months training. Although military officials were opposed to the amendment, the House adopted it by a unanimous vote. However, the bill does not provide for the recall of men already in combat who did not have 6 months training. Volunteer soldiers and sailors under 19 are not affected by the amendment. And today in the Pacific, American task forces in the Philippines are clearing the Japs from the southern Negros Island. The assault troops went ashore on excellent beaches yesterday, the second invasion thrust on Negros Island within less than a month. And now here on the home front, here are the Major League Baseball scores from today's games. In the National League, the New York Giants shut out the Brooklyn Dodgers 5-0. Chicago Cubs beat Pittsburgh 7-3. St. Louis lost to Cincinnati 2-1. In the American League, the New York Yankees were defeated by Washington 6-4, and Boston Red Sox lost to Philadelphia 5-3. And that's the news to this moment. Roger Bowman speaking. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
12 midnight Eastern Wartime. You are listening to station WEAF 660 on your dial in New York. As a public service, 20th Century Fox, producers of Ernst Lubitsch, A Royal Scandal, presents a program of the NBC Midnight News. A Royal Scandal, starring Tallulah Bankhead, Charles Coburn, Ann Baxter, and William Ith, is now playing at the Roxy Theater. Plus, on the Roxy stage in person, Hazel Scott, Jackie Miles, the Hartmans, Dick Brown, and other acts. And now the news. The dispatches from Europe, which today detailed an account of American troops joining up with the Russians, have already given way to new bulletins from the battle for Berlin. One dispatch says that Soviet troops have occupied the Reichsbank building in Berlin, which is within several blocks of the center of the Nazi government, Hitler's own chancellery. And Moscow tells us that Russian light bombers now are using the Tempelhof airdrome. From there, the bombers are making just a short hop to pinpoint bomb the remaining pockets of Nazi resistance. One report says 9/10 of Berlin is in Russian hands. Down along the Elbe and Mulde rivers, at the point of our juncture with the Russians, the points of contact are growing more numerous, and the jointly held territory is expanding. It is possible that the Russians and Americans are joined along a 50-mile front. That meeting today was one of historic importance, but also one of joyous celebration. Immediately after this broadcast, we will hear John McVane's report of how the Russians and Americans came together, a report from the First Army Front. There may be another meeting place for the two armies. General Patton is driving down through Austria, meeting the Russians coming up through Austria. This Third Army today captured the German city of Regensburg and moved ahead toward the next city. The bag of German prisoners came up today with General Kurt Dietmars, the German radio's official war commentator. He said he expects Germany to quit fighting several days after Berlin falls. The general had little faith in those mountain strongholds of the South. America's Fifth Army in Italy also is making speedy progress. It drove today in the big Italian port of Genoa, and columns headed for the Brenner Pass in the Alps reported that German resistance was disorganized. Several more once important Frenchmen are coming home. Into Switzerland today came General Gamelin, who commanded the French armies at the time of their defeat in 1940. 3 former premiers of France also are at the Swiss border coming home. Ex-premiers Herriot, Reynaud, and Daladier. And old Marshal Pétain, back in Paris, was placed in jail to await his trial by the new French government, trial for treason. Out in San Francisco, the United Nations delegates made 3 important moves today. Number 1, they agreed to rotate the chairmanship of the conference with the foreign secretaries of Russia, China, England, and the United States. Each secretary will take his turn as chairman. Decision number 2, the conference agreed to give 3 votes to Soviet Russia in the proposed World Assembly. That was the Russian request. 3 votes, and the request was voted after President Truman wrote the conference that he would follow President Roosevelt's agreement to back the Russian request. Decision number 3, the conference turned down the Warsaw government of Poland, which the Russians had asked to be invited to the conference. The Soviet delegation has accepted this decision. And out in the Pacific, the battle for Okinawa Island goes on. But Admiral Nimitz reports that Jap troops have pulled out of their first-line defenses on the southern end of the island. Now they are fighting in their secondary positions. And here's the weather forecast for New York and vicinity. Tomorrow, sunny and cool, and for Sunday, increasing cloudiness and somewhat warmer. The midnight temperature on Manhattan, 44 degrees. And you have just listened to a program of the NBC Midnight News, brought to you as a public service by 20th Century Fox, producers of Ernst Lubitsch, A Royal Scandal, starring Tallulah Bankhead, Charles Coburn, Ann Baxter, and William Ife. A Royal Scandal is now playing at the Roxy Theater, plus on the Roxy stage in person, Hazel Scott, Jackie Miles, the Hartmans, Dick Brown, and other acts. This is Don Pardo speaking, and this is the National Broadcasting Company.
Combined armies had covered 700 miles, cut Germany in 2, and shattered the last hope of the Germans. From Stalingrad and Pearl Harbor, we've come a long way. It's a fine-looking army, the Red Army. Men of medium height, clear-eyed, alert-looking. They dress well and hold themselves proudly. You get the idea that here are men who are sure of themselves and their ability, inferior to none. I'd always heard the Russians were secretive, that American reporters weren't allowed to visit their front lines. Well, we visited their front from the front. and we got a greeting so honestly glad and warm that even though we didn't use the same words, we knew we were speaking the same language in our hearts. I'd been roaming up and down the American front lines in the Mulder River for several days, waiting for the Red Army to arrive. It was a great thrill when, from our hilltop above the Mulder, we saw Russian tanks and vehicles, saw German villages under Russian shell fire. And when we established contact with their tank radios, it seemed very close, the meeting of the two armies. But the Russians who came to a hill 3 or 4 miles from the Mulder were only on patrol, and they pulled back to the Elbe. A sudden tip sent us speeding from one division sector to the neighboring American 69th Division area. Our own patrols weren't supposed to penetrate too far, but a couple of adventuresome young lieutenants, Lieutenant Albert Kotzebue of Houston, Texas, and Lieutenant William D. Robertson of Los Angeles, became slightly deaf, or didn't hear the radio or something, and met the Russians at Treaser and Torgau at 1:32 and 4 o'clock on the afternoon of Wednesday, April the 25th. I got the news about 5:30 and hustled to the 69th. So did about 20 or 30 more reporters, collecting like flies from nowhere. There we learned the patrols had evidently upset Supreme Headquarters plans about as much as the Remagen Bridge had. The idea seemed to have been that a sedate meeting would be staged sometime. Then a couple of brash young lieutenants went off and reported back that they had made contact. Later that night, we saw Lieutenant Robertson. He's a slight fellow with a wispy blonde mustache. With him was some of the Russians, come back with him to arrange a more formal meeting. His story was exciting. He didn't have any recognition flares, and the Russians fired the wrong one. Robertson yelled, "Tovarish, comrade," and there was some shooting at him. Then the whole thing began to get straightened out. He met a Russian soldier sitting on the sloping girder of a wrecked bridge. They pounded each other's shoulders in comradely fashion. Then Robertson shinnied over to meet the Russian division commander. They gave him wine, a can of sardines, chocolate, and biscuits. Then they insisted he have a drink of German schnapps. Robertson traded watches with the Russian captain. It was like a meeting of friends anywhere. Get over the language difficulty by smiling and saying good and taking a drink together and wishing like the devil you could express what you feel. Robertson was a typical American boy. One of the Russian officers must have been about his age. He looked more intense than the American, but both gave us that impression of youth, the period before things get too complicated. Lieutenant Robertson found the Russians were a little suspicious because the day before, some krauts had waved the American flag at the Russians and yelled that they were Americans. When the Russians started coming toward them, the Germans opened fire and killed some Russians. All the Germans were killed, but it left the Russians with a healthy skepticism. One of the Russian officers said he and his soldiers were overjoyed, so glad and so astounded they didn't know whether to invite the Americans to go for a jeep ride with them, have a drink of vodka, or go attack the Germans together. They compromised on the vodka. All this got the correspondents quite excited. Colonel C.M. Adams of Houston, Texas, commander of the 273rd Infantry Regiment, was going next morning to meet the Russians. We decided to follow. We crossed the Mulder and headed east. We started out 4 cars, but we picked up 8 or 10 more with an obliging officer and a .30 caliber machine gun. Only the patrols had passed that way. The territory hadn't been occupied by either army. Warm sun, dust rising from the jeep wheels, and green fields. That was your impression. The country seemed strangely empty. We didn't know anything about it except that a patrol had been over the road the previous day and probably another in the early morning. You didn't know where the Germans were, whether they'd show fight if you met them, or what you could do about it if they did. Our own lines seemed a long way away, and so did the Russians. Some of the villages seemed desolate, windows shuttered. But on the roads was a stranger, more motley stream of human beings than you could find anywhere else in the world. Handsome cabs, fiacres, covered with bedding, filled with household belongings, and the families walking or riding. 12 million people from all over Europe, the slave laborers, drafted by Germany to till her fields, keep her war industries going, under the lash. That's literal. In almost every house I've been in, you find a rawhide lash. In one house, I found a flexible piece of rubber-covered iron tubing with a handle. Now, the 12 million are going home. Czech and Serb, Frenchman, Dutchman, Belgian, women, children, all on their way. Our drivers also freed thousands and thousands of war prisoners. Uniforms of every allied nation are on the road. The Indian Sikhs were the most smart in their salute, the most rigid at attention as we swept past. The Germans in that no-man's land between the Mulder and the Elbe are on the move. Fear of the Russians or forced evacuation by the Nazis put them on the road. We stopped them on the Mulder, so they're going in two directions. Add to this mixture German soldiers, some still carrying their weapons. German patrols still pass through the territory. Other thousands have quit, thrown their rifles away, and headed down the road to surrender. Many of the German villagers waved at us. They thought we were coming to take over the territory, and in their minds, at this last minute of the last hour, we've suddenly become popular, at least in comparison with the Russians, the lesser of two evils. An average village would have a bunch of Germans out in the square, waving to us and pointing away. A few British Tommies waving. Some French soldiers on bicycles going through. Some Russian prisoners of war cooking on the bank for the roadside. Some Germans and slave laborers moving along the road, pushing carts or baby carriages full of bedding and belongings. And some farmers driving their ox carts to the fields. You wave and are never sure to whom you're waving, ally or enemy. Suddenly our road ended in the woods at a roadblock. Logs across the way, forming a barrier, and we'd been told a patrol had been here only the day before. Trees without bark gleam white. Branches are off, all around the block. Signs of a heavy artillery fire against just this point. Shell nose caps lie on the ground. We turned, went back, and took another road. Torgau seemed empty. We went through one empty street after another. A town looks very dead when you take out the people. Into an empty square, and suddenly Russians, a few, evidently an outpost, appeared at doorways. We ran to them, pounded them on the back, said unintelligible things. We were glad and they were glad. That was the main thing. The Red Army men told us their command post was on the other side of the River Elbe. Down at the bank of the river, it looked something like a miniature Coney Island. The Russian slave laborers were getting ready to go back to their own country. They were collecting on the bank. One civilian was playing a Russian tune on the accordion to some of the Red Army men. Women and children were scattered about, calling to each other. The Germans had blown the bridges, and their spans had fallen into the stream. The Torgau Rowing Club was being emptied of boats to provide ferries. Racing shells, clinker-built craft, pairs, eights. The Russian laborers were carrying them down and loading aboard, then off, paddling with 16-foot oars into the rushing stream. Some carried bicycles, carts. About the only thing I didn't see in the frail craft were jeeps. At the edge of the river, I met Lieutenant Nikolai Bogush from Minsk. He's in the Guards Division with whom we made contact. I'd been saving some German brandy to offer the Russians. But he took one look at the bottle and said, "Deutsch? German?" I said, "Yes." He shook his head. "Nix gut," and drew his finger across his throat, laughing. "American gut. Deutsch nix gut," he went on, and shook his head again. 3 of us pulled out a boat, fitted oars, and set out. I rowed and managed to get across at where I wanted to go. The American colonel had been negotiating a meeting of the division commanders. The division commanders would negotiate a meeting of the corps commanders, and so on, up through the army till it reached a meeting of General Bradley and Marshal Konyev, or maybe higher. That's military etiquette, and the Russians are sticklers for etiquette. Since we were probably the first British and Americans to see a Russian front line, we looked them over carefully. They looked tough, competent, and well-equipped. Their guns were good and skillfully in place. The officers and men dress up in a way that our more easygoing army doesn't. The Russians wore all their medals and stars, plenty of them. One officer, a colonel, told us he'd never allow the variety of dress you find in our army, and the slapdash individualistic dress of the correspondents may have shocked him. Most of us felt like going and getting our Class A uniforms to wear whenever we meet the Russians again. I thought I'd found a Red Army woman fighter, khaki uniform, Guards insignia, and Medal of Merit on her bosom. She told me she was a nurse, but she carried an automatic pistol in the holster at her hip. She'd been at the front for 2 years, but she flushed even quicker than an American girl might, and we paid her a compliment. In the officers' mess, all was somewhat confused with the reporters milling around, some lunching with the Russian officers on captured German food, others trying to carry on interviews with those who spoke some other language but Russian. With the rest, it was a strange pidgin language, Tovarich, Tovarich, over and over, and things like me kamerad, Ruski, Red Army, Stalin, Gut, Germani, Fini. But the real language was our smiles. Lieutenant Dmitri Ebert spoke pretty good English, but he said we were the first Americans or English he'd ever talked with. He asked me to tell what I saw, to try to describe the happiness of the Russian officers and men. They were happy, all right. Breakfast had turned into lunch. Bottles of vodka and white wine were getting emptier as toasts were drunk in the Russian fashion, bottoms up to both our armies, to Allies, to Marshal Stalin, and the late President Roosevelt. The food was German Army food, and it was hard to get out of the room without eating or drinking too much. The Russian officers and men had chests filled with decorations and stars. They looked more tough and military than German officers, who look in real life like Erich von Stroheim playing German officers. The difference was there was no swagger or affectation about the Russians. They looked like men who'd done a good job and knew it and felt they could beat the Germans any time they met them. I felt very glad they were our allies.
And that is John McBain's report to NBC of the scenes when Russians and Americans met today on the soil of Germany. For WEAF's late listeners, we have brought you a recording of our First Army reporter's account of the proceedings